Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur and I hope you're doing well. Today I reread The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, which is a fantastic science fiction novella from 1895. I first read it at the age of like 7 or 8, loved it. It was an abridged Children's Illustrated Classic version, but I loved it. I was fascinated by it, reread that book multiple times, ultimately grabbed, the full unabridged novella, unabridged novella, and have read this. This is the second time now that I've read it, since graduating from college, and both times I've really enjoyed it. Wells, it's an adventure story. Primarily, it's an adventure story within the science fiction. There's science, there's Victorian thought around sociology, economic thought. Wells is skeptical of the technology and how industrialization has helped humanity, like how we are closer and more human and more perfect humans through this, and are we? And I think the main message of this adventure, it can be read as a parable. I tried to preserve myself from the horror that was coming upon me by regarding it as a rigorous punishment of human selfishness. Man had been content to live in ease and delight upon the labors of his fellow man, had taken necessity as his watchword and excuse, and in the fullness of time, necessity had come home to him. I even tried a Carlyle-like scorn of this wretched aristocracy in decay. But this attitude of mind was impossible. However great their intellectual degradation, the Eloi had kept too much of the human form not to claim my sympathy, and to make me perforce a sharer in their degradation and their fear. And that, I think, is probably like if you were if Wells was trying to tell you, what was the whole point of this, glorious adventure tale, that would probably be it. He, like I said, he's very skeptical about where society is heading. But it really is a great adventure tale. So very briefly, in broad strokes, if you've never read this book, I'm about to spoil the heck out of it. Please just pause, go read it. It's a 115-page novella. It's an excellent little read. But we have a time traveler who he's surrounded by at the beginning in a frame narrative by this sort of Greek chorus of the editor and the medical man and the psychologist and the journalist, and they all they're totally skeptical about this time traveling. They don't really think most of them, except for our narrator, don't think it happened. The narrator is then recording what the time traveler tells all of them after he's spent basically a week 800,000 years in the future. There, in that society, he is still in London, but he finds the world's environment has changed. It's warmer. There's really no weather. He encounters these humans who are smaller than he is, who have a very limited vocabulary, who sort of just seem to gallivant about and play and act almost like children. They dance, they play with flowers, they eat fruit, and then they all sleep in these large, dilapidated rooms, but comfortable rooms, common rooms almost together. And those are the Eloi. And then gradually there's these monsters that he grows to learn and speculate more and more about, whom he calls the Morlocks, and who seem to exist underground and are the antagonists. They are very frightening. He has lost his time machine. He goes kind of wandering off, and when he gets back, the time machine's gone. And it turns out the Morlocks have stolen it. And living underground, about the only thing they fear is light or fire, and so he ends up using matches to sort of scare them. He also starts a forest fire at one point, unwittingly, and ultimately gets his time machine back, having discovered the truth of what the relationship is between the Morlocks and the Eloi, and goes millions of years into the future to discover that the sun has grown larger, Earth has totally changed, there are no humans, there are only these monstrous crabs that scare the living daylights out of the time traveler. They scared the living daylights out of me when I first read this as a kid. And ultimately he goes to a little bit deeper and finds there's basically no life except for some weird thing on the beach, at the water's edge. And he hightails it back to finish telling us his story. And, it's an adventure story. It's Robinson Crusoe with Victorian sociology, science, and economic thought, like dressing it up. And it's effective. It's interesting. Wells is very careful to characterize the Morlocks in such a way that they are scary. They are frightening. We do sympathize with the Eloi, even as the time traveler realizes what has happened and why this has happened. That, in that Victorian era where there were so many, workers who like worked underground in mines or lived and basically had very little access to light and were sort of like kept underground in society, they have become the Morlocks, and the aristocracy, the decayed aristocracy, have almost no intelligence and are basically human cattle to be eaten by the Morlocks. And it's like that realization when you're reading this at the age of 7 or 8 is quite frightening. I first read it in a Children's Illustrated Classic edition, like in these like old paperback ones, where it had the pictures on every other page. The Morlocks were scary, but it, as much as it's a parable and sort of this caution around like humans need to be kind to other humans to prevent this future from occurring, it is really just a fascinating adventure, and there's a lot of interesting science in it. I remember reading it for the very first time. What I was most drawn to was the scene where, at the very beginning, the time traveler is arguing for the existence of a fourth dimension of time, and he shows a picture that has, length and breadth and thickness, and it shows like, the same man at different ages of life, as as a boy, as a young man, as an adolescent, as a young man, and older, and he shows like this is showing time in this fourth dimension, and in the abridged version, they don't. You're abridging a 115-page novella. So there's not a huge amount to abridge. The plot was all there, all the major characters were there, the characterizations were there. What was missing were some of the bits where Wells like pontificates on, science or on economics or sociology. That was what's abridged for the kids. Not the cannibalistic Morlocks. That's not abridged. That's included. So he has this question around like, can a perfect cube exist instantaneously? Can it exist in only one moment and not in other moments? And that's a great question. And it pushes at this idea of like what time travel would be like and how time truly is a fourth dimension. This of course predates, Einstein's general and special theories of relativity by about 10 years. And this idea of like four-dimensional space-time. And it does it in a very compelling way and with a very compelling illustration. Like as a kid, I was like, tell me more about this. Like time is the fourth dimension. Like I'm down with that. Like I'm very curious. And it's something that I always enjoy, at the end of the year, I always enjoy those lessons when I taught physics about, let's talk about, the speed of light and relativity and time travel. Let's have some curiosity here, some wonder. So again, this is just a book that I really like. I find it fascinating. Every time I read it, I enjoy it. The runner-up in terms of my reading of H.G. Wells would be The Island of Dr. Moreau. I think this is a very effective and interesting book that, again, hits at some of those same themes in a way that I didn't find The Invisible Man or War of the Worlds to quite, nail down. There's also this idea that, 90-ish years after H.G. Wells wrote that book, there was this idea of the time machine specifically, and the writings of Jules Verne kind of as the other half of it, as early science fiction were this sense of like the progenitors of steampunk, a genre I happen to love. And K.W. Jeter coined that term to describe this idea of what he and Tim Powers had originally kind of thought of as historical fantasy. So it is science fiction or fantasy set in a Victorian era that is going to now involve generally pre-World War I technologies, but that will, do some other stuff. They're set in those Victorian times and they do a lot of other things. Tim Powers involves time travel explicitly in the Anubis Gates, which is my favorite of his works. And I'm not going to reread that this month, but the two that I am going to read are, one, The Black God's Drums by P. Djèlí Clark, which is a steampunk novella set in the U.S., in the United States. I'm very much like, I haven't read this before, but Janet Remembered Reads just was effusive in praising this, and so I'm looking forward to reading it. And then this will be a reread, and this is one of my favorite steampunk books of all time, and that is Morlock Night by K.W. Jeter. And as you can tell from the title, this is, all bets are off, an unofficial sequel to The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. And it's from the 1970s. It is fantastic. It is an absolute trip. When I read this several years ago for the first time, I was entranced. It took a book that I had loved as a kid, and then it did so many more things, so many interesting things. So I'll be reading both of those later this month, and very much looking forward to returning to Morlock Night, and very much looking forward to first encountering the Black God's drums. So that's The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. Have a great evening.